Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for Cybersecurity for Retirement Plans. I have just a few announcements. For those of you who are requesting credit, please note that to receive CE credit, you must remain logged in the video portion of the webinar for the entire program. Logging into the audio portion only is not sufficient for CE credit. Continuing education credits are being offered for the following designations: CPE, CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, RMA, CFP, and SHRM. Also, at the end of the webinar, we would like to request that all attendees fill out the evaluation form that will pop up. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many questions as we can, but we want to be respectful of your schedule and end on time. If we don't get to your question today, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. Now let's get started. We are joined today by Kate Blake, instructional designer and technology trainer at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in retirement benefit fields. And being the quick learner and talented contributor she is, Kate quickly arose into various positions within Pentegra. Kate's been able to exemplify her deep roots of industry expertise in each position she's held, and her skills have always been the perfect complement to Pentegra's culture. Kate, I'll turn this over to you to start talking about plan designs.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. We have 4 main goals that we'd like to accomplish over the next hour. First, we'll talk about the latest guidance on cybersecurity for qualified retirement plans. We'll then talk about the various documents that the DOL has released, which can help us navigate this guidance. We'll look at the tips for hiring a plan service provider. We'll take a look at cybersecurity program best practices for qualified retirement plans. And lastly, we'll close out with a look at the role of the financial advisor when it comes to cybersecurity. Now, cybersecurity can be a very challenging subject to navigate, but it can also provide opportunities for advisors in the retirement plan space. So why are we talking about this today? Well, the internet has been around for a while, but crime, and particularly financial crime, has been around for a lot longer. So let's talk about Willie Sutton. Willie Sutton was a 1930s bank robber. And as you can see on this slide, when he was finally attained and asked, hey, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where the money is. And the same really holds true for our retirement plans today. And we see that in the numbers. The number of reported data breaches has increased in recent years, according to the Identity Theft Resource Center. There were 1,862 data breaches in 2021, according to them, up from 1,108 data breaches in 2020. So what is happening that is causing this significant increase in data breaches that we're seeing? Well, again, because that's where the money is. And specifically when it comes to retirement plans, the lack of cybersecurity protocol for these plans and for the administration around them is what's making them vulnerable. There are a lot of areas of weakness in these types of retirement plans, and a lot of that has to do with the numbers of players involved. This is a wide and varied industry, and you could have one retirement plan, and working on that one retirement plan or involved in it could be a plan sponsor, a payroll provider, a custodian, a record keeper, a TPA, plan participants, and their beneficiaries. So I think I've named no less than a half a dozen different people and entities here who may be involved in these types of retirement plans. And that is in part what's making them an easy target. So with tens of trillions of dollars at stake, what kind of cybersecurity guidance do we have available? In short, not much. So as you can see here, we have a DOL regulation on electronic delivery regulation, which for those of you who work with things like statements and annual notices, you're probably familiar with those guidelines. In essence, a plan sponsor must ensure that the electronic system that it uses keeps participants' personal information relating to their accounts and benefits confidential. But that's all it says. And there's no comprehensive cybersecurity protocol for retirement plan administration at the federal level, although as you can see here on the slide, many states do have their own individual cybersecurity laws. But one of the problems that we face there is that, of course, laws vary from state to state. So we have this DOL guidance, and this was a start, but there was additionally no guidance describing something like who retains the fiduciary liability for a breach, or any practical guidelines whatsoever. And what we've seen is that this lack of guidance around cybersecurity in the retirement plan space is causing these types of issues to bubble up in our court system. Here's an example, Bartnett v. Abbott Labs, which is a case from 2020. And as you can see here, Bartnett was the plan participant who was an employee at Abbott Labs. $245,000 was stolen from this former employee's account by a cyber thief. Bartnett, the former employee, alleged that the defendants were Abbott Labs and Alight, who was the benefits administrator for the plan. Bartnett alleged that the defendants failed to enforce a security question and instead gave a one-time passcode to a cyber thief over the phone, among other issues. As far as the verdict was concerned, the court found the plan sponsor not liable, but the record keeper, as you can see here, failed to protect Bartnett's personal information and properly notify her of important changes to her account. And even this, if you're not regularly involved with the retirement plan space, even that verdict can seem confusing. So who really was at fault here? It's important to understand when we're talking about cybersecurity, and we'll take a look at this today, what are the different parties and what is their role? So the plan sponsor in this case was Abbott Labs, the entity sponsoring or offering this retirement plan. So the court found them not liable. The record keeper, we mentioned earlier, that was Alight. So they said that they failed to protect their personal information, and as you can see here, they found them liable. What's even more interesting about this case to me was that the outcome, we saw $245,000 was stolen from the account. Abbott Labs offered this participant a take it or leave it offer, which was a fraction of her account balance, a fraction of this $245,000. She rejected that take it or leave it offer from Abbott, which is where this lawsuit originated. So instead of taking the take it or leave it offer, she sued both Abbott and Alight. So, the action of the cyber thief was possible by not having appropriate controls in place. It bubbling up in the court system happened because we don't or didn't until recently have appropriate guidelines in place. So you can see how it's a big issue. And as far as the plan participant is concerned, even in light of this court case, she only ended up recovering $108,485,000. So she lost, almost $140,000 because of this incident. Now, since then, that was in 2020, there have been some changes. So since then, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, issued a report, and this was in February 2021, and they recommended that the DOL do two things. Formally state whether it's a fiduciary's responsibility to mitigate cybersecurity risks, and establish minimum expectations for addressing cybersecurity risks in defined contribution plans. So if we come back to that Bartnett versus Abbott court case, these two things, had these two recommendations been in place prior to that event occurring, that could have mitigated or prevented the issue from occurring altogether. Number one, there would have been clarity around who the responsible party would have been without it having to go through the court system. And number two, it may never have occurred at all had the record keeper had minimum standards in place for addressing those cybersecurity risks. So the GAO, again, in February 2021 said, hey, DOL, you guys need to take some kind of action here. And the DOL did, and very swiftly, in fact. As you can see, on April 14th, 2021, just a couple months later, the DOL issued 3 cybersecurity directives. These are the trifecta of DOL guidance, so the 3 points of light on cybersecurity that we have to look to now in the retirement plan space. Tips for hiring a service provider, cybersecurity program best practices, and online security tips. So the reason why we have 3 is because there's one for each type of person or entity who might come into contact with a retirement plan. The tips for hiring a service provider is geared towards plan sponsors. The program best practices is geared towards record keepers. And the online security tips, that one is geared towards individual plan participants. All right, so let's pause here now that we've taken a moment to review the history of cybersecurity regulation in this country, and let's open up our first poll question. So as it relates to cybersecurity, the DOL's current policy, A, has specific rules and regulations for plan sponsors to follow. B, does not require plan sponsors to have formal policies. C, has guidelines for plan sponsors to follow its best practices. Or D, both B and C.
This poll will be available for another 15 seconds. The poll is now closed. Kate, you may continue.
Great, thanks so much, Jen. And if you answered D, both B and C, you are correct. And I have to admit, when I gave this presentation, my first review, this question actually caught me off guard. I initially thought, well, you know, we don't really have specific rules and regulations, so it's not A. But you know, we don't have too much in the way of formal procedure. But we do have guidelines, as we mentioned, and that's those 3 points of light that we previously mentioned. So C is definitely true, but as you can see in B, we still don't require plan sponsors to have formal policies. So while we've got these recommendations, they are not yet requirements. Although certainly for anybody listening to today's call, we're going to go over these 3 documents next, and I strongly encourage you to incorporate them into your retirement plan practices, even though they're not, necessarily required. All right, so let's dive into the DOL's 3 points of light, starting with tips for hiring a service provider. Now, keep in mind that even though we can outsource certain responsibilities, if we are a plan sponsor, still retain the fiduciary responsibility to prudently select and monitor all service providers. This piece helps plan sponsors prudently select and monitor a provider with strong cybersecurity practices. So it's got a lot of things that it includes in here. So you can see on the right side, we'll dive into these 3 points, but it's got 6 points. It's got 6 points that we'll take a look at that will help you hire an appropriate service provider and monitor them on an ongoing basis. And this, by the way, can be useful regardless of the role that you are in. So you could be a plan sponsor, this is useful to you for obvious reasons. This is the document that's directed specifically towards you to help you, again, with hiring a service provider. But if you are listening and you are a service provider, this document is still useful because it helps you get into the head of what your clients may be looking for. And the same thing holds true if you are an advisor who's listening today. I think many of our plan sponsors and employers don't know that these three pieces from the DOL exist. So I think it's our job, as plan partners, especially if we're in that advisor role, to make our clients aware of these three pieces and help them understand the highlights from each three. By the way, all you have to do is just search for, you can go right to Google, just search for DOL cybersecurity guidance, and you'll see it's the very first search result. It'll be a page from the DOL, and it'll have all three of these documents linked. So let's talk about the different ways that we can focus on hiring a service provider and monitoring a service provider that has strong cybersecurity practices. So what you're going to notice, we're going to go through the next 2 slides. It's going to have 6 different criteria that you should consider when working with service providers. But I think for all of them, if I recall correctly, and as you can see here, the first word is going to be document. So documenting what we are doing is really the key. It's the key to fiduciary risk mitigation here. So what are we documenting? Information security standards, and by that I mean practices, policies, and procedures. Audit results. Are we benchmarking the audit results to some reasonableness standard? What this could look like is if you are a service provider and if you are a plan sponsor, like if you're an employer sponsoring a retirement plan and you're hiring a service provider, what this could look like would be asking the question, can you supply me your most recent audit? Do you have, if applicable, SOC 1 and SOC 2 audit results? Can you forward those to us? And retaining those in some central repository so that you can prove if you are audited, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, that you have fulfilled these recommendations. So it's not just about practices, policies, and procedures, though. It's about what are we doing with them. So the next thing that we're going to document, validation practices, security levels and standards, and I like this third bullet point, this one's key to me, implementation, processes, and procedures. So not only is it what policies do you have, how are you implementing them, and then kind of following through to the third item here, their track record. So what are you doing, how are you implementing it, and what is your track record? Those are 3 very important questions that the DOL is recommending that you, as a plan sponsor or employer, ask of a service provider. And again, if you are an advisor listening, knowing these pieces and sharing that with our clients is key. The other pieces to look for, if we ask them for their results and there have been any past security breaches, ask them about the remedies. What did you do to make participants whole? Did you offer any, ongoing services? What was the resolution there? Also, it is perfectly okay and acceptable to ask vendors to supply their insurance information, and that should, again, be documented in that central repository. There may be a separate policy, a rider, or additional information about losses that would be associated with cybersecurity and identity theft breaches. So it is possible that there may be some sort of insurance policy, but then additional information beyond that, specifically relative to cybersecurity. I think it's important to specifically ask that question. When we're talking about cybersecurity, what happens if there is a breach? Who is responsible for making somebody whole? And what does that process look like? And then through your review, document anything that stands out to you. So is there any specific contractual language that assigns responsibility back to you as an employer or plan sponsor? Are there any cybersecurity red flags? So here in step 4, we documented any breaches that we were told about in step 3. In step 6, we talk about those. If there were any breaches, is that a material impact on us? Is that going to affect our choice of service provider? What we're really doing here is coming full circle. We're not only requesting the documents, but we're storing them. We're making sure we look at them, request any material specific to the context of cybersecurity, and then we, in-house with our partners, are analyzing them, noting any red flags, and making sure we have all of that documented in our records. It sounds daunting if you've never done it before, but having worked with a lot of plan sponsors and an equal number of vendors over the years, I think the key is to having an appropriate framework in place. And I think prior to 2021, we didn't have that framework in place. As you saw, the GAO guidance, it was just kind of like, you're responsible for cybersecurity, go. But with 2021's 3 points of light, now we have this specific document with 6 very specific steps that we can take to show that we're fulfilling our fiduciary responsibility when it comes to hiring and maintaining our service provider relationships. The bottom line here, really, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Get it reviewed and translated. And when I say get it reviewed, what I mean is make sure you have someone who's familiar with cybersecurity practices to help you. Remember ERISA's prudent expert standard for plan fiduciaries. So if I am in HR and I am requesting these documents because I, work for an employer who's sponsoring a retirement plan, and it's part of my responsibility to conduct vendor due diligence, I can get the documents and store them, but that's not all. Get it reviewed again. So maybe I'm forwarding them to my internal compliance officer to review and store. Maybe I'm sending them to my IT department if, for example, there were any red flags that occurred and I need to do additional due diligence, things of that nature. Why do we do this? Well, we do this because DOL investigations have begun. The DOL is already checking the cybersecurity procedures of plans that are currently under audit. They are asking for a lot. I'm going to share with you some of the items that they may ask for relative to cybersecurity in an audit. So this can include things like, I'm going to rattle off a laundry list. We'll come back to some of these items later. I just want to give you a sense for the scope. Policies, procedures, and guidelines related to data governance, classification and disposal, implementation of access controls, identity management like MFA, business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response procedures, assessment of security risks, data privacy procedures, management of vendors and third-party service providers, which is the document that we just spoke about, that those 6 points provide you guidance for that piece. Cybersecurity awareness training, encryption to protect all sensitive information, both transmitted and stored. So really a variety of pieces of information that they're asking for. So again, we covered some of that under the first document that we looked at. But now let's discuss some best practices for record keepers and other plan service providers with respect to cybersecurity and retirement plans. So it's not just monitoring your service providers. That's one piece of it that we looked at. Other things that you can do to make sure that you are covering all of your bases when it comes to cybersecurity: ensure the safe and secure transport of employee deferrals from the payroll provider to the record keeper. So here's a recommendation for you. You could send a letter or an email to your payroll provider requesting their processes, procedures, and remediations. You can just store this, again, with whatever. You can create a file, call it cybersecurity or whatever you would like to call it. Store their response with that and all your other files that we've talked about. Same thing for your record keeper. So document their policies, procedures. You can also send them a letter. As far as participants are concerned, because your service providers are just one piece of the puzzle, you have presumably plan participants as well. Ensure that they also have adequate information to mitigate potential breaches. This includes things like cybersecurity training. This could be integrated into your financial wellness offering. I know here at Pentegra, we have periodic cybersecurity training that is required. You know, our compliance team tries to make it fun, as fun as cybersecurity training can be, but I like the suggestion to integrate it into your financial wellness offering. There are a lot of organizations, you know, benefits brokers and things like that can help you with that because, you know, when I, as an employee of Pentegra, receive my cybersecurity training, it's not just training on how to mitigate risks here at work, it's training on how to mitigate risks in my own personal life as a plan participant myself. So, you know, if you are an employer watching this, not only is it imperative for our needs as plan sponsors and people who work with retirement plans, but it does make a kind of neat, you know, employee benefit that you can also offer as well. All right, so time for another poll question. Plan sponsors should request documentation from the following service providers regarding policies, procedures, and remediation for cybersecurity breaches: the payroll provider, the record keeper, the plan advisor, or all of the above.
This poll will be available for another 15 seconds. The poll is now closed. Kate, you may continue.
Great. And to everybody listening, if you selected answer D, you are correct. All of the above. You know, I think that comes through very clearly in the DOL cybersecurity guidance. But I do love the way this question is worded because I think that these three words, you know, if everything that we talked about is too much, too detailed for you, hone in on these three words: policies, procedures, and remediation, because I think that very succinctly describes what we're looking to get in writing from really not only the providers mentioned on screen here, but any service provider who works with the plan. So that could include a trustee, a custodian, anybody who, you know, is handling or touching assets that belong to plan participants. All right. Next, we'll discuss best practices for record keepers and other plan service providers. So in this first piece, we talked about the document that is applicable to plan sponsors for purposes of monitoring service providers. Now let's switch gears and look at it from the provider, the service provider perspective. So I am a record keeper or a TPA or a trustee or a custodian, or again, you know, somebody who's working or handling retirement plan assets in some way. What do I need to do? Well, this is the Cybersecurity Best Practices document. So again, just go to Google, DOL, Cybersecurity. It'll be the first document. And again, all three of these documents are linked right there. So this one is a little bit more in depth. So on the first one, we had 6 pieces of information that we should request and monitor. Here, service providers have 12 steps to follow in order to manage their cybersecurity risk. And I think, you know, before we look at those tips, I think it's important to talk about what type of risks that there could be. Just risks from, you know, people who are attempting to gain access to plan documents, but also risks of, you know, not clearly having our procedures and responsibilities defined. So let's take a look. Speaking of having it defined, that's really number one here. If I'm a record keeper or some type of service provider, I need to have a formal, well-documented program because, as we saw previously, that's what I'm going to supply when the plan sponsors are asking me for it, which they now are recommended to do in order to fulfill their own due diligence. So if I, as a service provider, do not have a cybersecurity program, that at this point, given that these recommendations are 2 years old, is a little bit of a red flag. It's time to get a program in place. Conduct prudent annual risk assessments. So this could look like, penetration testing. Are people able to access your systems? This could look like, tests for your employees where you assess their ability to, identify a risk. Have a reliable annual third-party audit of security controls. So while you may be able to, assess, do a preliminary risk assessment, having an annual third-party audit is critical because they will be able to help you see weaknesses that you do not see yourself. I mentioned before the SOC 1 and SOC 2 audits for record keepers handling plan assets. Those are commonly requested documents, so I would request those from any vendors who participate in that audit. Clearly define and assign information security roles and responsibilities. So that could take a number of forms. Is there a compliance officer if necessary? So, do you have FINRA registered representatives at your organization who are subject to rules and regulations? If so, you need to have a defined compliance officer to help you manage that program and the risk associated with that program. Do you have an information security officer in your organization? So, this is somebody who would be responsible for coordinating steps 1, 2, and 3 above. Frequently, I've seen organizations that do not have an information security officer role, and tasks 1 through 3 above tend to get sort of delegated to, frequently it's HR. I've seen finance take over those tasks. It's better if you have a dedicated party if you are in the record keeping space. Have strong access control procedures. So who is able to access data? It should really be, principles of least access. Only people who need to have access to the data should have access to the data. And any organization that you are working with, or if, you are an organization providing these services, it's important to have protocol in place that indicates who has access to what data. Most software programs have these types of permission-based systems within them already. It's just a matter of making sure that you have defined internal protocols to determine who gets what access. Because if you have software that offers, access controls, but you don't have the procedures around it as a record keeper, you're not fulfilling this recommendation. Having the procedures is key. Yet another reason why number 4 is so important, having that defined role, because number 5, again, this is another thing that if you don't have that defined role, it's just going to get delegated to who's available or, who's closest to this information, which frequently tends to be HR or finance. Ensure that any assets or data stored in the cloud or managed by a third-party service provider are subject to appropriate security reviews and independent security assessments. It's not enough to just say, oh, we have roles and responsibilities. Again, the audit is key. Are they willingly supplying you this information on an annual basis when you are requesting it for review? That is key too. Conduct periodic cybersecurity awareness training. So we already talked about this. This is kind of a nice little thing that you could add on as an employee benefit. But beyond that, it really is critical so that people, handle data accurately internally. I mentioned a couple of ideas already, penetration testing. You could test people with phishing emails. There are a lot of different ways that you can do this. Are people appropriately sending information that is secure? Is it password protected? Is it encrypted? Are people using the correct protocols to communicate that data? All of that could be included in a periodic cybersecurity awareness training. It doesn't have to be all the time. It can be an annual thing, or it could be, periodic reminders that you send out. But again, having the plan and having it in writing and in a predetermined fashion as a record keeper is key because, as we've seen, employers are going to ask you for this information. Implement and manage a secure system development lifecycle system program. So this again, we mentioned that you need to have an internal point person for this. This again is why this is key. It's not just enough to say that you're doing this stuff. What are you doing with this information? Are you reviewing these procedures on a periodic basis? You should be, and you should have somebody who is overseeing that program for you. Business continuity, disaster recovery, and incident response. COVID, I think, showed why all of these are important, beyond cybersecurity. These don't need to be fancy policies, but you should have information documented and available in a public location within your organization as far as how will information be delineated in the event of a disaster, where and when will people be expected to work in the event of a disaster. And I know one thing that I saw frequently from working with clients, they want to know is, when can we expect systems to come back up in the event of a disaster? So I know, for us, when we review our disaster recovery, we literally go system by system and assign a time frame to it. So we'll say, certain operations will be up in 24 hours, others will be up in 48, but we very clearly delineate what will be available and when. And again, just so critical for so many reasons beyond cybersecurity. Number 10, encrypt sensitive data stored and in transit. This used to be just the sending of the password protected email, but I think at this point, if you are a record keeper, you really should have some sort of secure data transmission platform. And again, if I was a plan sponsor or an advisor reviewing this information, I would ask for information about specifically how sensitive data is stored, again, with the expectation that there should be a platform for that. Implement strong technical, actually, I want to say one more thing about number 10. Sorry to go back, but it's interesting for me to see this presentation because I've worked with people both, on the employer side, on the advisor side, on the vendor side. So I've seen all sides of this, and I want to say, for everybody, sensitive data is important. So not just if I'm a record keeper holding the data, but if I'm a plan sponsor or an advisor, if that platform is available to me, if there's a method of secure data transmission, please use it. I do see far too many people in a variety of roles these days still sending password protected emails. Yes, it gets the job done, but it's just better if you use whatever secure data transmission platform your vendors are making available to you. And if you don't know what platforms are available to you, ask your vendors, and I'm sure that they would be more than happy to train you on the softwares that they do have available, because again, most have them at this point. And if you're an advisor, make sure to periodically remind the plan sponsors, employers, and participants that you work with to use those platforms as well. And I'll get off my soapbox now about sensitive data transmission. Number 11, implement strong technical controls in accordance with best security practices. Again, this ties into things like principles of least access. What are people using to log in? Where are people working? How are people working? How are you documenting that? And things of that nature. All the more reason, again, why under item 4, you have that person who handles all 12 of these items. And appropriately respond to any past cybersecurity incidents. This is critical because, as you saw from the DOL recommendations for employers, we're supposed to be asking vendors about this stuff now. So if something happened, it's not enough to just move on and, close the chapter on it. If you had a cybersecurity incident as a record keeper at TPA or anybody who handles retirement plan data or assets, it's critical to document that, document what happened, and document the practices that you are taking as an organization to make sure that that is not going to happen again. because that's something that your clients will be looking to see. So again, we said it already, but get it all in writing. It's really critical, both from the employer side and from the service provider side. All right, so it's time for our third polling question today. True or false? Plan sponsors should require written policies and all insurance contracts from their service providers regarding cybersecurity.
This poll will be open for another 15 seconds. The poll is now closed. Kate, you may continue.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we all understand by now that the answer is true. We should be requesting all written policies and insurance contracts from service providers. All right, our third cybersecurity best practices piece from the DOL is for plan participants. According to an IBM study, 95% of cybersecurity breaches are due to human error in handling one's own data, believe it or not. Another report indicated that human error resulted in a loss of over $3 million in 2020 alone. So, where is our weak link? Possibly with plan participants. So that's why the DOL has these three separate documents, because the needs of, an employer for purposes of vendor management, a record keeper in terms of setting the procedure, very different from the needs of plan participants. So this document, if you're an advisor, you can download this. Well, even if you're any sort of role that deals with plan participants, an advisor, a plan sponsor, HR, you can download this document, have it handy, and give it to the plan participants that you work with. Because just like the other ones, this just contains a couple of important tips that can help plan participants avoid any cybersecurity issues. So here we go. Register, set up, and routinely monitor the account. I know as we go through this list, we all, I assume most of us are, or all of us are retirement plan practitioners in some capacity. So I know that this is going to seem very basic to us. But I also know from working with plan participants for 15 years that if you hand this set of tips to a random group of people, a not insignificant portion will not have completed step one. So, sometimes just getting people registered is important, because we don't want, for example, an authenticated account with a default set of logon credentials floating around out there. That is a recipe for issues. Use strong and unique passwords. Of course, we know this, but again, this is where, we talked about that cybersecurity training. This can be an employee benefit. A lot of people don't necessarily know how to create strong and unique passwords. One really great way that I've seen people use recently is to use phrases. A lot of times phrases can be a lot more difficult to guess than just say, your standard password, which many of plan participants are still using bad default passwords, dates of birth, addresses, phone numbers, things that they probably shouldn't be using in this day and age. So we can help them by providing them guidance to help them understand what a strong password is. MFA, if it's available, participants should be using it. But the thing I see a lot of times with MFA is people don't always know how to set it up. And sometimes I see participants are not afraid, but embarrassed to ask because they think that they might be the only one with the problem. So I think, again, as basic as these items seem here to us, I think sharing them with employees and plan participants and just letting them know that it's okay to have these types of questions, I think goes a long way towards breaking down that barrier of employees feeling like they can't ask the question. Keep personal contact information current. This can take a lot of forms. Addresses, beneficiary information are the two that jump out to me. Something that we can do as either service providers, advisors, or employers is provide periodic reminders to people about these things. An email reminder once per year, hey, update your beneficiary designation. From personal experience, it can go a long way. I think sometimes even ourselves, when it comes to our own, designations and keeping things current, it just takes that little extra nudge. Close or delete unused accounts. One way that we as retirement plan practitioners can help with this is if you are an advisor, talking to people about rollovers and the different options. If we are a record keeper, cash outs, under the cash out dollar amount, we can automatically pay out people's benefits. If we are an employer, in an exit interview, helping people understand their different options. And, a lot of times I think maybe even if we're in HR, we don't necessarily know what options are out there because, we're not terminated employees. So maybe that's a question for your record keeper or your advisor. Hey, what does it look like really when somebody terminates? Can you walk me through the process so I can better educate my employees? Be wary of free Wi-Fi, the airport, Starbucks. I think we all know at this point because we are retirement plan or other professionals, but again, just a lot of our employees and plan participants don't. The phishing attacks are getting so realistic these days. One thing that is really hammered into us here at Pentegra that I think is just important to pass along to employees is if you're not sure, just hover your mouse over a link. If there's a link in an email, and you hover your mouse over it, it'll show you the destination address. A lot of times we can tell right then and there it's a bad address or something's funky or not right with it. Use antivirus software and keep apps and software current. I think with all of these, there are a lot of ways that we, as a bridge to a retirement plan for employees can help them. If we are an employer, maybe this is another, employee benefit that could possibly be offered if you have a corporate version of antivirus software. Could you potentially work out, a deal where it could be offered to employees for some sort of a discount or something along those lines? But again, just letting people know what they need to do, and also, providing the avenue to help facilitate for them is really important when it comes to something so important as cybersecurity. And how to report identity theft and cybersecurity incidents. And that could also take a variety of different forms, but I'll just give you a couple of examples. Maybe something has happened that needs to be reported to the DOL. That could be one avenue. The DOL has, a specific website, again, as I mentioned before, devoted to this, and, specific people that you can contact. Or maybe if you are an employer, maybe you offer some sort of red flag reporting service as, another employee benefit, where if somebody sees some sort of, questionable behavior, they could report that on an anonymous basis. I know that that's something that we offer at Pentegra, and I think is very helpful towards providing people an avenue, to share information that may be questionable. Again, I think it comes back to a lot of times people don't want to say the wrong thing. Maybe if something happened to their account and it happened because they never set it up and they're embarrassed and now they don't want to come to you about it. Well, if we give them these documents and we let them know what to do, where to go if they have questions or issues, again, I think that can go a long way towards closing that knowledge gap and just helping people feel more comfortable with a topic that inherently is uncomfortable. There are just so many ways through our own business activities that we can help facilitate this for participants. Okay, So we have about 10 minutes left here, and we have one more topic that I'd like to cover with our time remaining, which is the role of the financial advisor in cybersecurity. So many plan sponsors and fiduciaries are not well versed in cybersecurity protocol, and I think that is to be expected. These three documents that we reviewed today, again, they've only been out for 2 years. Prior to this, we really have very limited guidance, so there is a knowledge gap. And while I think that that can be a negative thing, obviously, again, this is a serious issue. We've talked about, huge dollar amounts, millions of dollars in losses, and almost $2,000 in breaches that we saw in recent years. But I think that this also can be potentially an opportunity for advisors. So let's talk about this. How can advisors support plan sponsors when it comes to cybersecurity? Number one, I love this first bullet point, the idea of this chief governance officer role. And I think that really is a great way to frame the advisor role when it comes to retirement plans. There's a lot going on. Employers and plan sponsors are, presumably running their business on a day-to-day basis, not necessarily worrying about cybersecurity when it comes to retirement plans and what are these three documents and what are the recommendations and what do I need to request and stuff like that. You as an advisor in this role can assist in gathering the written documentation from payroll providers and other retirement plan providers. So all this stuff that we talked about today, if I'm an advisor, I may have these three documents at the ready. I've got my 3 DOL recommendations for sponsors, record keepers, and participants. I understand the contents of all three and the recommendations contained within each. And maybe I have, maybe I have a template or something that I could share with my partners and plan sponsors and employers that I work with that has information on what to request, how to request it, and where to store it, just kind of distilled down for them. And, we've distilled it down for you here in these 3 questions. And then participant education. It's so critical. Cyber criminals are going to go for the weakest link when it comes to retirement plans. And often the weakest link, I hate to say it, but they are our retirement plan participants. And again, it is because they are not familiar with the DOL guidance. They are not familiar with what's happening in the industry. Many times in the retirement field, they could be retirees. You could have a 70-year-old retiree who may or may not have a computer or internet access at home who, really just may not have any understanding of this at all whatsoever. So as an advisor, a great value add is to support financial wellness programs that incorporate cybersecurity best practices. So if you meet with participants on a one-on-one basis or if you talk to them over the phone, maybe just in addition to what's your asset allocation, how much are you saving, and are you on track? Maybe also there's a short discussion. It doesn't have to be long, maybe 5 minutes, just touch base, hey, you've got all this money saved. Here's some additional information on how you can protect yourselves from cyber criminals. And then you can leave that DOL participant guidance as a takeaway for them. I think that this is something that is sorely needed in the industry. And I think that the advisors who embrace these DOL cybersecurity recommendations and come up with a framework to help their employers and plan sponsors, I think that those are going to be the advisors who are going to be successful in the coming decades, because this issue, it's not going away. I think also when it comes to service provider contracts, this is another area where advisors can add value. Contracts can be so difficult for an employer who is just trying to run their business. They may not necessarily be familiar, again, with the cybersecurity protocol that we've reviewed today. You can help them with that. You can help them with their periodic risk assessments and help them with establishing their own due diligence standards. You can also help your clients understand whether cybersecurity insurance is needed. So you can help them, first consider the need, evaluate whether it has a role in cyber risk management strategy, and if there is a need, you could help them understand the different insurance programs that are available and what they cover. Also, sometimes service providers will have their own insurance, as we mentioned earlier, to bring it kind of back around to the beginning. When we're requesting documents from service providers, we're asking them about this. But again, if I'm an employer, I may just blindly be collecting this information and not really knowing what it means. An advisor could very easily step into a role where they can help employers decode this critical information and really provide that extra value add. All right, we have just enough time for our final poll question here. So, which of the following is a cybersecurity best practice? Have a formal, well-documented cybersecurity program is answer A. B, conduct prudent annual risk assessments. C, have a reliable annual third-party audit of security controls. Or D, all of the above.
This poll will be open for another 15 seconds. The poll is now closed. Kate, you may continue.
Great, thanks so much. And I think you probably all can tell by now that this last poll question was a giveaway because I wanted to reiterate the key pieces of security best practice before we close out. So have your program, do your risk assessments, and make sure you have that annual third-party audit. Before we close out, let's review with a couple of key takeaways. I know we covered really a lot of information today, but I think the key is to make sure to understand that the DOL requires that plan sponsors make sure that the electronic systems that they use keep the information confidential. Understand that while there is no comprehensive protocol at this point, we do have 3 pieces providing guidelines. Know what those pieces are, know where to find them. Again, just Google DOL cybersecurity guidelines. You'll find the sponsor, record keeper, and participant pieces. Download them, bookmark them. Just make sure you have them available for future reference. And understand that advisors, whether you are one or work with one, can play a really critical role in a support function when it comes to cybersecurity. And following these, procedures and just practical recommendations, this is going to help protect us against the onslaught of this, modern day Willie Sutton, who is trying to look for those weak links and trying to exploit them. We want to make sure that we as retirement plan professionals and other practitioners are one step ahead of them by making sure that we take these recommendations seriously. All right, well, with that said, that concludes my prepared remarks today. Jen, did any questions pop up in the chat box that I can answer with the last minute or two here?
No, we did not receive any questions at this time.
Okay, great. Well, if any questions come into the chat box, as you mentioned at the beginning, certainly I'll be happy to answer them. And I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
All right, great. Thank you, Kate. And thank you, everyone who attended today's webinar. Any questions we didn't get through today, we'll follow up with you separately. As a reminder, please complete the survey questions that will pop up in your screen in about a minute. Everyone, have a great rest of your day, and thank you.